Welcome to Levels of Connection, where we discuss how human connections work and why they're so important. Welcome to Levels of Connection. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Marc Tognotti, who is the co-founder of Infinity Point. We spoke about his wealth of experience from the US to Africa in large and small projects, in his wealth of experience in building communities across the globe, and the importance of teamwork, of community work, of self-reflection, of being open and changing perspectives and evolving perspectives. Really interesting conversation. Enjoy. Here.
It's a joy, Stefanos, to be here with you. So glad you're in my life. I love our connection. I want to build our connection, and talking about connection, what a great way to do it.
Thanks, Marc. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you. We were having a conversation earlier, and I tried to describe people in either a picture or a couple of words, and the two words that came to mind for you, Marc, considering your vast experience in different countries from Africa to the US with different cultures, your experience in business, in university, teaching, lecturing, facilitating. There's one common theme that sort of the common thread through all of that experience. And for me, what resonated is that it's two words. You build community. And that's really, those two words really, when I think of you, that's what comes to me. And a builder of communities, and that's what you're doing now with Infinity Point as well, as the founder and president. And that really excites me because I also have this obsession around connecting. And builder of community is all about connecting and realizing those intricacies, how you build things, how you bridge things, how you bridge communication, how you bridge connection, how you facilitate the communication. So welcome, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. Generous. I feel so honored. I feel seen, and I accept that. Builder of community. I've conceived myself that way ever since I think I was in grad school. And one of the main things I was studying in grad school, while I'm studying philosophy and poetry and literature and history, one of the things I'm asking myself is, where is all my pain from? I had a lot of family pain, I would call it, and trying to find out what the answer was. And at some point, I had a huge aha that perhaps the greatest part of my pain was cultural. It wasn't, I realized the source wasn't me. It was something wrong in our culture, something about our family dynamic, something about the way things are structured and organized that is hurting my natural, given, loving self. And I went from a place of kind of being anchored in shame and guilt. Why can't I fit in? Why do I feel disconnected? Why am I unhappy? And looking outside myself for the answers to saying, wow, so many people share my pain, share this trouble. It's the culture which has taken some turns that is crying out for restructuring and for some different kinds of wisdom than we're relying on in our current civilization. So that sent me on a big journey, and such a long journey, so many twists and turns. And the most recent one, I don't recall if you just mentioned Infinity Point, but our current organization that brought me and you together, there was a huge turn that I made from this kind of nonprofit world where I was trying to change culture and help people connect with each other, to actually working with business, finance, economics, which I'd always seen as somehow apart. And now I see that is so key to creating the conditions for the kind of connection that I think are possible on a large, grand scale.
Talk to me more about the aha moment that you had that you just described.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways into it. So I spent a lot of time, as you said, as a facilitator, a connector, bringing people into conversation. I was at helping lead these kind of emotional and social intelligence development groups at the university context, and talking about connection, helping people connect. I was leading these large group processes, bringing together 50, 100, even 600 people, helping them to connect in conversation with each other. And that was all well and good. I often felt like a voice crying in the wilderness. Had a lot of successes, a lot of growth there. There's so many things I could go into. But a key moment for me came when I was invited. I got this sense like, okay, I've learned what I have to learn about bringing people together in these large group processes, which was a ton. There was a point where I started feeling like a need for something else. And this surprising thing happened when I befriended this fellow, and it turned out he was very wealthy. And he asked me one day if I would help him start making grants. He wanted to give away his money in a country called Zambia in Africa. Would you lead my grant making program there and maybe in Zimbabwe? And I said, sure. So that sounded great, very exciting. So I started going to Africa and these African communities. And one of the main things one of the main obstacles I had is how to connect with these communities, people living on less than $1 a day, for example. When I come in I'm seen as the donor, the super wealthy guy. Everybody, that is a very strong power to have everybody's attention, and trying to break through and make personal connection with people when they're seeing you like as a, gleaming fund of dollar signs, and they need money more than anything else is what they're thinking. That was a challenge. And what happened was the economics in these African communities hit me in the face, because I realized that these people were so much in many of these communities under such conditions of scarcity and constant pressure, day to day. How am I going to get food on the table tomorrow? I started to realize that connection has economic preconditions. It's a luxury to connect in the way that I did in the large group processes that were paid for by big corporations or big organizations, or sometimes middle-class communities would help fund them, or the conversations we had at Stanford, reaching very high levels of connection with very sophisticated, beautiful theories.
So it was a luxury.
It's a huge luxury. And so I started to see the economics of it. And there were many other dimensions. We get into these. An interesting thing that happened to me was that, so I'd go to these African communities, and I'd actually spent, weeks living in their communities, like in a hut with no lights, no running water, sleeping there, being with these people. I learned so much from this. And first appearances, and I brought some visitors from the US too, and I watched them have the same experience. Wow, these people live together. They know each other so well. They have such deep levels of community. They go to the water well. They pump the water together. The women sing. The songs are so beautiful. And it sparked a certain nostalgia for community in me and others, visitors who went there, that we felt that we're missing in America. But then as I scratched the surface a little more deeply and spent more time there, I started to notice that despite this certain level of community, which had a beauty to it, I don't want to diminish it, I was shocked at some of the underlying dynamics of well, for one thing, there's a lot of theft in these communities. People are very afraid, like, where are you going to keep your money so nobody else can get it if you've got a little bit? There's a lot of like, from my point of view, everybody here is dirt poor. I almost don't like to say that word, but just everyone's earning less than $1 a day. They are struggling. But in their points of view, there's so much of this, I'm more wealthy than this person next to me. So they're busy making all these distinctions, and there's power-seeking individuals in these communities. Everybody's looking for their personal advantage. So this part started to show up more to me.
It sounds like a regular community in any part of the world where there's comparison, jealousy,
Exactly.
So it's just a different scale or different setting.
That's very true. And in fact, the more time I spend over there, the more these communities help me to see the United States better.
In what way?
Well, here's one way. So what okay, how do I go into that? Well, let's leave that question aside a bit.
Okay.
I'm trying to get to my story in a less roundabout way, but
It's all good. We've got time.
Yeah, okay, good. One of the things I started to realize is that people are economically very isolated. So we've got these communities with a lot of community togetherness, but one thing they have a very hard time with is talking about money and wealth and who's better in a better wealth position than the other, which was very familiar to me in the US, my family. We don't talk about money, and there's lots of kind of shadow dynamics going on, within our families about money and things like that. And here I saw this in Africa. Once I got past that initial kind of impression that they had some community that we didn't, which I do think that they do on some level. And I worked a lot with the savings group thing is very popular over there, micro savings. So a small group of women, like 8 women, is brought together under in a savings group, and they all agree that one of them is going to hold the group pot of money. And they each bring like a nickel or a dime a week into this pot until it builds up. And then one of them takes a loan, and they go out and, for example, buy a baby goat. Then they raise it, with this capital, and then they sell it at a profit. And then they come back to the group and they bring the money back to the group together with interest. And so now it goes on to the next person. And one of the theories of microfinance, which I was very interested in and supportive of at first, is that this will create social connection in the group also. And maybe it did on a micro level, but what I started to see is everybody's on their own economically. So everybody is constantly, every day, by hook or crook, trying to find out some means of getting, dinner on the table tomorrow. And there's almost no economic collaboration. And even in these microfinance savings groups, it's still built on a model of individuals being completely isolated in their economic enterprise, except for the borrowing part in the savings group. So I saw the potential of, for example, in this one community, there's probably 40, 60 people raising bees, and they've they each do beekeeping in their idiosyncratic way, and then each person, hopefully, a couple times a year, has a little pot of honey or bucket of honey, and they bring it to market as individuals.
Mm.
So I saw an opportunity to help these communities understand money and finance together and form enterprises, collective enterprises. So one of the first things we did is we started in creating a honey enterprise, and it's still building. And they're going to build 500 new hives this year. They'll have up to 700 hives. We've got 40 or 50 beekeepers working together on this honey project. And it's democratizing their economics, and it's helping to see them, helping them to see how they can be stronger together, and develop a culture, a learning culture
Mm-hmm.
through the economics.
Did you see a big
Yeah.
difference in the way that they connect with one another versus your other experience, either with the large groups, research and work that you did in the US, or other ways that people connect in the US versus the work that you did in Africa?
The large group work that I did in the US was very useful in Africa to a degree. Except in the US, collective organizing, like people creating companies or
Mm.
organizations, that was a big part of the US work. So there was already a lot of facility and knowledge around how do you create an organization? How do
Mm.
you gather together people with their different roles and responsibilities to do something together? I mean, maybe we don't realize how much knowledge we have already in creating and being in an organization and coordinating, collaborating towards a joint purpose.
Mm.
Um, in these communities, there's very little of that. The ones that I'm thinking of, they have organizations like their churches, but those don't really, for the most part, organize concerted action.
But they had a way of connecting and communicating and organizing just in a different manner. How did you see it when you first got there? Their way of doing things.
Mm, I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that. One of the things we did when we helped their communities organize conversations is we asked them to identify all the many organizations and structures that they have. They do certainly have structures. They
Mhm.
have chiefs and headmen in these tribal communities, for example. They have churches. They do have social groups. We have them create a map of all the organizations in their community, and then in one way or another have them all present in these large group conversations that we would organize. Um, there's a lot that I don't quite understand, but what we had noticed was that um, in our view is because they were so economically dependent
Mm.
and not able to generate much wealth or income from themselves, and so fragmented as individuals, is that what you had was people turning to environmental resources, like taking down trees or
Mm.
killing wildlife or whatever, to try and make a dollar, and then selling that on the market.
So it was more
That
about surviving than anything else.
Yeah, more about surviving. So they weren't able to organize to take care of their environment and their culture, which they saw deteriorating as. I mean, the particular community I'm thinking of, they were displaced from their lands by
Mm.
the government because they lived in a high concentration wildlife area, and they were forced out so that a national park could be made to protect the wildlife and environment, which is a horrible travesty that's happening in wildlife conservation all around the world. The indigenous people who've cared for and lived closely with these environments for many generations are now seen as they're kicked out in order to fence off these environments, because it's thought that the wild needs to be separated from the human, something like that. So some of these communities we're working with are very much struggling to retain their culture and old ways of doing things. They were cut off from their normal ways of surviving, making a living, and they want to retain their culture and their identity and their traditions, but they've taken a huge blow. And a lot of their community, they keep losing young men who go off to mining companies. They leave the community. They go to urban areas looking for jobs. So one of the big issues is to give them the wherewithal to provide for their own, economic needs, so that they can attend to these other social and cultural issues.
So all these lessons that you got from that experience, what were the key learnings that you brought that apply now? Because a lot of that community is the work that you're doing with Infinity Point.
Yeah. So I was talking about the big shift that I had with Infinity Point. And it was a big shift for me to go from holding conversations to create connection, to looking at the kind of underlying economics. So that was one of the huge realizations I had in Africa, is that if people are afraid, or they've got to work every day from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and be constantly in a sense of urgency to just get food on the table or provide them for themselves economically, they don't have the luxury of really getting into connection, reflecting on their connections outside of economics, and they're more motivated by job security. How do I make money? All these urgencies in their life. So I started to understand more, in a way, all the privileges that I had economically, growing up in a middle-class family, going to Stanford University, spending days and days and days reading books and literature and reflecting. Not everybody can do that.
Yeah.
And so I started to look at the economics, and I was realizing how many of the injustices that I had kind of organized myself around in my pre-Africa days, how many of the concerns about our social structure and all that were really due to economics in ways that I hadn't seen before. Even in American communities, I did a lot of work trying to bring neighborhoods together to have conversations. And a lot of it was very beautiful, but most people just didn't see that they had an interest in getting together with their neighbors. They couldn't take time off of their jobs, was one of the main reasons that we couldn't get certain kinds of people in these conversations. So things were happening to me from both sides. Even when I would have these large group conversations, it could be within a single company, it could be a lot of companies together. Often I would bring government, business, education, communities together into large group conversations. I started to realize that these conversations are creating economic value. If you can coordinate stakeholders together with one another, and they function better with one another, and they understand their needs and goals and objectives better with one another, you're starting to improve the economics. And then I was kind of asking myself, where is this extra value going? And then it became more clear to me. I mean, I already understood that we had a severe problem with wealth concentration
Mm.
in our country and in Western countries, and that one of the primary reasons that we've lost trust in our political institutions is that with industrialization and the enormous concentration of wealth, that economics has taken over our politics. And so all these things were kind of brewing together inside me. And I started to realize that a large part of me, and I think we see this in our world today, in this distinction between the nonprofit and for profit realms. I think that's a very sharp dividing line in our world. And the way I see it is that largely we think of for profit business as about making money, and nonprofits are about values
Mm.
and
Mhm.
social good and volunteering. And I think this bifurcation is one of the main problems in our world today. Um, as we all know, nonprofits, they've got to get funding from somewhere.
Exactly.
There was one time in my life when I was like, why do these nonprofits talk about money all the time? I'm not here to talk about money. Let's just do what needs to be done.
They need
And
money too, right, to do it.
but they need it. And where do they get it? They got to get it from the for-profit sector,
Hmm.
directly or indirectly, eventually. So I started thinking a lot about money and what money was, and and I started to realize that money was really a metric for human energy. How do we organize human energy? How much human energy is there? How do we mobilize it?
Mm.
And I started thinking about money and economics in terms of as being instruments of social organization, tools for concerted action.
Mm.
I mean, all my work in my conversation space was about how do you get people to collaborate together. And I realized companies, organizations, businesses, they are very effective modes of collaboration.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, to make short of it, what I started to believe in was that, okay, we've got these very powerful organizations which teach people to connect with each other in collaborative ways so they can produce value for others. That's a business. And um, there's a lot of potential there for democratic collaboration. To me, the main problem was the way that industry is organized today is that, yeah, it helps people to it brings people together to collaborate and learn from each other, create learning environments in very large numbers, but the surplus value that's created all goes to a very few people. So the
Mhm.
profits are all generated upwards. So then I started to see the potential in creating worker-owned companies, which we're doing in these African communities, is how can we teach them collectively to create economic enterprises that serve their own interests, without creating this hierarchy of a few that dominate over all the others.
And to
And
parallel that with the
yeah,
the US, the work that you're doing in the US, you're helping through Infinity Point employees become owners of the companies through the ESOP buyout, which is again keeping jobs in the community, empowering people from the community, and turning them into business owners and entrepreneurs through the work that you're doing there. Talk to us a little bit more about that and the parallels between the two.
right. So one of the things is I'm working with these African communities, and I come in there as a donor, somebody with money, and everybody's like, ooh, they all organize around me. They'll circle me, and they're all looking for things, and I try to organize collaboration and okay, what can we do together that's important? And I start to realize they'll say yes to anything I say.
Mm.
So that's a problem.
Mm.
So how can we get people to surface their own needs and visions? And when they don't have any self-esteem and they don't think they know anything and they don't have any resources, they don't know how to organize themselves to do that. They don't even believe in themselves. And these nonprofit organizations, these donors coming from outside, usually they have the solutions and answers. They're not helping people to grow their own, recognize and grow their own potential. And so it creates this ongoing culture of dependency. Can you ask me your question again? Oh yeah.
Go ahead. It's about the organizing of what you mentioned about, empowering people to become self-sustained and create their own value instead of having this
Right.
dependency, and the work that you're doing through Infinity Point, through ESOPs, and encouraging employees to become business owners through the buyouts.
Right. So I'm trying to, because it was my journey in Africa that led me to employee ownership in the United States. And I got so excited about that. I
Yeah.
met Bimmy and we created Infinity Point. But it was really encountering myself in these conditions in Africa, which did help me to see, as I said earlier, and maybe I'll give more insight into it, more about what was going on in the United States, which I hadn't really seen as clearly. So I saw that I saw the psychological and social impacts of economic isolation over there and why these communities couldn't connect with each other to enjoy collaborative economic power. A lot of it is the psychology of everybody depending on their own little household for economic survival. Why did they not know how to connect with each other around economics? Well, one reason is they see economic value as belonging to other people, like donors. They don't know what money is. They don't know how to start a business enterprise. One of the reasons they don't know how to start a business enterprise is because if there's $1 there, everybody wants it. They get into fighting. And so they don't know how to handle money and power dynamics. Like, this is another thing that happened. We come into these communities, we start to give them a little money to organize their own projects. Certain people in the community would come in and try to take over. And everybody is just convinced that the way the world works is that some people are at the top and have all the power, and everybody else has to follow them. And so they couldn't conceive of how to create a space or an organization in which everyone had a voice, in which people discovered common goals and objectives, and then could organize around every person contributing to creating a world that everybody else wanted. So that was my large group work, was bringing people into conversation from all parts of a community or organization or association or association of groups, finding common objectives. Those common objectives would be the highest level of juice that gave everybody in an organization juice that everybody would work towards. Then they could coordinate towards each other to achieve these common objectives. So what I did in Africa, I started with this large group work, but my question became, how do we bring these dynamics, these community dynamics, these democratic dynamics into the economics? Because right now the economics and the current economic structures that were available to people were just keeping them from enjoying community and realizing their own power to create the world that they wanted. So this is when I started exploring helping communities create workaround enterprises there. And one of the first things they needed to do was to learn to trust each other with money. That was one of the main things. And this is one of the places where I had an insight that those really dull and boring practices that we know as accounting, double book entry, all that stuff, it's a way of creating trust in organizations so that we can handle money.
Transparency reporting,
all that stuff. And so I started to see that if we could bring open book accounting and have everybody learn how the money works
Mm.
and how to track money and how to see how they generate money and how they can create value together, we could start to create trust in these communities and greatly up-level their ability to collaborate together, to manage the money, to grow the money. And that became the vision. And so I started to see in these things like money, finance, capitalism, all these things that I had put aside as not related to community and connecting is in fact very powerful tools
Mm.
that it's like I see a next, at some point people learned reading and writing, right? That was a huge achievement that in most, at least developed countries, most countries, people now, everybody knows how to read and write. So that was a certain level. We call it literacy, right? But now I'm starting to see we've entered this capital industrialist era where some people have figured out how to use accounting, finance, all these legal structures, et cetera, to create corporations that create huge value. But there's a very elite priesthood now who knows that language. So I want to democratize that language and democratize the accounting, the money, but also the company and the ability of people to think and act like owners.
So that
In
brought you
order,
to employee ownership.
yeah, that brought me to employee ownership.
Mm.
Yeah. So now instead of seeing capitalism and money and finance as the bad guys, I actually see these as tools that the grassroots can begin to appropriate in
Mhm.
its own interests. And it was a big thing for me to go from seeing money as something like, who cares about money, to actually seeing money as having a potential pure aspect to it.
Mm.
And from seeing accounting and bookkeeping as boring and dull, and capitalism as bad, I now believe that capitalism has an inner purpose to unleash human potential, to create democratic communities, um, and to empower
And
people to
it's how you use the tool, not the tool itself, right?
exactly. So it's new for me to see capitalism as a set of tools, looking to find the right use or get into the right hands, that can be completely beneficial instead of kind of the enemy that we need to tear down. So many of my liberal friends are still in that model.
And talk to me about because you mentioned something really interesting, that connecting is really a luxury. Because if you're in survival mode, you don't have connecting as a priority. You need to survive first, right? Talk to me a little bit
Yeah.
more about your experience with the employee ownership and the connecting side of that.
Right. So we've been working with business owners. I mean, there's connection on every level. So we're working with business owners to transition. Usually it's to their founders, not in every case. Very often they're founders looking at retiring and they want to exit their company, is the word that's used,
Mm.
leave the company, and they don't usually they don't want to just leave it, shut the doors and leave it behind. Usually they're looking, one, to realize some of the value they've created in the business as an asset. They've spent their whole lives building it. They've earned an
Mhm.
income, um, but they want to keep it alive. And there's other people who would like to take over that business and pass on the ownership. And they're usually looking to pass ownership on to a large corporation, or outside buyer or a private equity firm. But we're helping owners to realize that they can transfer ownership to their employees
Mm.
through, especially through a incentive plan created by U.S. Congress, the employee stock ownership trusts.
Mhm.
Congress created a way for owners to sell their companies to their employees, and with certain incentives, Um,
How is the dynamic of the relationship or the connection between the existing owner and the existing employee or management team that's going to do the buyout?
yeah. So in almost all cases, when we start beginning working with owners to think about transitioning their company, transitioning ownership to their employees, what we find is that most of these business owners, they've spent their lives building their business, and they are very much at the center of the business and really the sole person in the company taking ownership responsibility.
Mm,
Um, and because they own it, they care about the business more than any other employee. And what tends to happen is the business owners are very much involved in making sure all the operations, uh, are being carried out efficiently, and they realize that most of the employees aren't really incentivized to carry about the business at the way they are. And these owners tend to be running at a million miles an hour in their heads, trying to control everything. They're like on this hamster wheel. It's exhausting to them. Um, and they're not aware that it doesn't have to be that way
mm,
from our perspective. So that's number one. Number two, if they're going to transfer to their employees ownership because they need to retire, they're aware that the employees need to be sort of trained up to be able to run the company on their own. Because
mm,
what the employees definitely can't do now without the owner is run it on their own,
yeah,
because the owner has put himself at the center of everything and hasn't known how to devolve that kind of responsibility. So step one in these companies is helping the owner to devolve that responsibility, help the owner to step up out of off the hamster wheel into a more mentoring kind
mm,
of role, usually up as chair of the board, beginning to look only at the larger strategic issues, and really help that team of people under him to think and act like owners. That's
mm,
what employee ownership is going to be all about. So we'll go into these companies, and we had a recent client, we said, we kind of explained to him that that's what we need to do. And he's totally on board with that, doesn't know how he's going to do it. Um, and we asked him, well, first thing we do, let's pull your management team together. Let's start interviewing them. And he's like, what management team? He even forgets that, he had appointed these people as managers, and he certainly didn't really think of them as a team before. And we'll go in. This is pretty typical. We'll start to interview the leadership team in the organization, and we'll find how dependent they are on the owner,
mm,
and how much relationships of dependency on the owner and control really reside in the owner, and how little they really know about the business. And we began a very slow process of transformation. In some cases, one company, in fact, we were just working with last week, people really just see themselves as following orders in the
mm,
business. They're like in some dark hole in the
mm.
company is how it looks to me. And I've just been here. I just do what he says. Yeah, I get a good paycheck, and
Yeah.
um, that's the way it is. And or this other group that we're with, yeah, I'm called the manager, but I never got trained in management. I don't really know what management is about. And well, you've got people under you, and that's managing. Well, yeah, that's true. Um, but then what we start to do is bring we create, like in most of these companies, it'll start with informing the employees that the owner wants to make a shift
Mm.
and give more responsibility and opportunity to each of the employees. And in every case I've seen, they wake up to that potential. They're also scared.
Yeah, it's a
We
new
start to
challenge
ask,
for them, right? New
yeah,
territory.
we start to ask them, what are all your pain points? What are all the challenges? What are the
Mm.
strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats you see in the organization? And in many cases, they haven't really been asked that. In some cases, they have. It depends on the level of development of the company. And then we start to engage them we start to open the books a bit, and we start to give them ideas which most of them have never seen. These are the company revenues. These are the costs and expenses.
Mm-hmm.
This is the current present, estimated business valuation. These are the numbers we need to drive in order to make the business successful. We see you as taking responsibility, or which numbers do you feel like you have responsibility for? Can you start to report these numbers week in, week out to the team that we're bringing you in conversation with?
And how do they generate business and look outside of the organization to connect with external parties to grow it and all that?
And we start going there. And what we see is just people starting to come alive in a whole new way, being included in a whole new way, starting to develop whole new levels of understanding. And a lot of it is around the financial books and the metrics, and really seeing how they how they have a handle on one of the controls in the company to drive the value of the company. And then as we change the relationships in the company, often this brings up discomfort, because we're used to doing things this way. Now you're asking me this, and kind of dynamics in the team which might not have come forward before. We invite people to talk about their relationships with each other, so they now it becomes an issue to handle your emotions and understand your emotions and learn how to deal with them in a constructive way with other people on the leadership team. So all this comes up, and so there's a big personal growth aspect to it.
In that journey and that work, how much is it process and how much is it heart-centered?
I think the heart is pretty much the center of everything, because if you want to get some process going and people don't have their heart in it, forget it. So I think we need to understand is that, number one, the heart drives everything. The heart is where people's yes or no is, where their resistance, their passion, their enthusiasm is.
How do you
So
communicate that to the teams?
it's a slow process. What we've been doing is we begin with some personality assessments, and you could call them values assessments, and kind of, what are the things you care about? And people come out on very different spectrums, and we have them consider, how happy are you in your work? Where does your natural energy want you to be? Where are you? In fact, what are the tensions that are created between the person you want to be in the role you want to have deeply inside yourself with the one that you actually got? And we start to awaken people and show them that the company's caring about this and interested, and it matters to us because we want to create an environment in which you feel like your heart is thriving. So we begin with just opening that space of conversation with each individual and having them, and for most of them, it's just an utterly new experience. They haven't been invited by their company to go there. Then we start inviting them to look at each other's, this is how I feel about where I am, and where I would like to go, and how aligned I am in my role with my heart's desire, so to speak. How do other people feel? And given these things and these different, the different kinds of energies different people on the team have, and how do we use this information to communicate with each other more effectively? So it comes from not just the individual, but then it goes to the team level. And so then we start to invite them to take more ownership of the organization's strategic direction, of its expenses, its revenues, all of the numbers, to take more ownership. And then one of the things we'll commonly do is throw in a few curveballs
You don't
just
want
to
them
help.
to get bored, right?
Don't want them to get bored, and we want to elicit the underlying reactivity that people are usually
Mm,
tamping down and they don't want to reveal in the group. Because when things get tough, what's going to happen? What's going to blow up?
mm,
And then people can start to perceive in a new way some of the different behaviors or pain points or learning areas that different people have on the team.
mhm,
And now, because we've started to structure the economic and success incentives in such a way that people realize they've all are invested in creating an optimal team dynamic. They
mm.
all are invested in helping each other to learn and to collaborate more effectively together.
And
We're
they're
all invested,
co-owners, right? They're invested, like you're saying.
and they're co-owners,
Yeah.
exactly. So once we have that basis, people really have a basis to contribute to each other's learning because they realize that what's in in the group interest is also in their highest personal interest. Um, and
Mo-
that really just sets this economic restructuring
mm,
really starts to put the values and personal growth opportunity in alignment with the economics.
mm,
And so that's what I'm looking to do
mm,
in Africa. It's what I'm looking to do in the United States.
mhm,
That's how I'd like to see our basic structures of organization of corporations change in the world is to align personal interest with collective interest
mhm.
through share and ownership.
Mark, after all the experiences that you had, the learnings, the countries that you've lived in, what would be the advice that you would give to young 20-year-old Mark around connecting with others?
Well, one short way of putting it is get out of your head and get into your heart and emotions.
Mm,
Um, you can spend all the time in the world trying to think your way out of your problems, but the truth is the one thing you can know in the world more securely than anything else is how you feel
mm,
and what you care about. And uh, that's really your chief guidance system. Thoughts are secondary. Your thoughts need to serve your heart um, and your heart connection with others. Thoughts easily get in the way of that.
And if you had to give advice to someone around how to create a habit of connecting with others, what would be the key ingredients that you would suggest to them?
Well, in my experience, connecting is a skill. You talk about the habit. So we need to learn to develop the skill. We have other habits that need to be overcome and unlearned. And unlearning takes a lot of work and a lot of practice. The tool that's been most useful to me is groups. Groups where I can get feedback, honest feedback
Mm,
that are there designed to give each other feedback. You can walk into you can be if you can be part of a group. This is what most helped me in my learning. I worked a lot in these groups of 12 people. I led these groups of 12 people. You can get 12 different perspectives
mm,
on every one of your behaviors and how well you're connecting or not with other people. Um, and and I find that being in a group really amplifies the level of intensity with which I I learn my what's holding me back,
mm.
and I learn what potential I have for connecting. And more than anything, that's helped me get into the habit. I think without that, without the support of the group, I'm not sure I could have. I certainly couldn't have done it as quickly as I have. Not to say I've done it quickly.
For someone that's watching this, if there would be one thing that you would encourage, like an immediate action for someone that would finish this episode, so in the next hour, to do something around connecting, to take an action around connecting, what would you encourage them to do?
I might encourage them to think about some place of dissatisfaction in their hearts they have with a current relationship. And I would ask them to go into their feelings about it. Notice all their thoughts. If they're like me, before I learned more to connect with my own heart, I would have been in thoughts like, oh, this person did that, this person did this, all about the other person. I would have had plenty of thoughts to justify or explain why that other person was wrong or bad or difficult to be with. I would go to that and I'd start to just let go of those thoughts and feel what I'm feeling. What is the pain I'm feeling? Do I have sadness? Do I have fear? Do I have anger? And then I would ask myself to say, how would I like to feel and be with that person?
Mm.
Of course, we know what that is. I'd like to have no sadness, pain, or anger. I'd like to feel loving for them and them to love me. And imagine and sit with that for a little while. I don't want to skip over the negative feelings part too quickly, because I often find that if I explore my negative feelings and I want to take ownership for them, start to ask, how am I contributing? How am I contributing to this? And how can I imagine myself in that other person's shoes? How might they be thinking and what they're saying? What information might that have for me that I'm not accepting or listening to? And it's really, I think, in opening that door to the other person and to just saying, gee, what if their complaints are legitimate? What if very likely they're feeling the things that I'm feeling? They're feeling anger, hurt, sadness. What if they were legitimate? And how might I, instead of then grounding in my thoughts, how might I change my view of that person and their context and what might be driving them in such a way that my feelings, if I do that, I'll start to feel my feelings dissolve in opening towards the other person and imagining myself in their shoes. And what happens then is I find all that thought structure that was supporting my negative feelings falls away. And I can locate myself in a new set of thoughts and a new approach to that other person that can be much, much more productive and that leads in the way that I want, towards that ideal relationship that I want with them. And that's the way it works for me.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you for today. I mean, it's always a pleasure to interact with you and have a conversation with you. And today was extra special for me. Thank you for supporting this initiative and for investing the time from your busy schedule. Besides the time that we get together and we share this together, which I loved, what else was useful for you from this reflection and this conversation that you've had today?
I'd like to have more of these conversations. I especially felt in anticipating our conversation and in thinking a little bit about all the questions you wrote up for me. I was really energized. It really got me into my heart and what I care about, and I really appreciated that. And I think these are super important issues to me, and I'm just excited to go forward.
It's always a pleasure, Marc. I'll see you soon, and you have an open conversation for the next episode, to be in Cyprus, so you should come over. You come to Africa as well, so we're pretty close.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've really been missing Europe. It's been quite a while since I've been there. My family comes from Italy, as you know.
Yeah.
and been a huge part of my life was that connection with Europe. I really miss being there. So
Well, now you have another excuse to come over, you know?
that'd be great. All right, I can't wait. I'm gonna put that on my list.
Thanks again,
All right,
Mark, and I'll
Stephanie,
see you
thank you so
soon.
much. Good luck with your project. I love it. I wish you all the best, and look forward to talking again soon.
See you soon. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching today's episode with Mark, and thank you for your continuous support to this channel. Please feel free to write your comments below and share with us what you found useful from today's episode. And any other comments would be fantastic. Greatly appreciated. See you soon.